The wind whispers across the red rocks of Arizona's Cochise County, stirring dust devils that dance between the weathered fence posts of a forgotten military outpost. As the sun sets behind the distant mesas, its golden light illuminates a solitary figure standing before a padlocked gate. When Margaret Reynolds, a 56-year-old former military nurse, reluctantly inherited her uncle's dilapidated desert property, real estate experts unanimously advised her to sell immediately. But an old letter discovered in Uncle Frank's office, bearing NASA's faded classified stamp, and the words Apollo 13 Operation Theta, led her to a concrete bunker hidden beneath the main house. Inside lay over $7.5 million worth of never-disclosed Apollo rescue equipment, meticulously preserved for half a century, and the truth about Frank's real role in America's most perilous moment in space. Today marks the 53rd anniversary of the Apollo 13 oxygen tank explosion, and what Margaret discovers won't just save her from bankruptcy, it will rewrite the space history we thought we knew. The desert holds secrets, some buried in sand, others locked in steel vaults beneath unassuming ranch houses. And sometimes the greatest treasures aren't measured in dollars, but in the forgotten heroes who worked in shadows while others reached for the stars. The antiseptic smell of the oncology ward clung to Margaret Reynolds' clothes as she emerged from the Veterans Hospital into the harsh Phoenix sunlight. 23 years of military nursing hadn't prepared her for being on the other side of medical news. The diagnosis, stage 2 breast cancer, still echoed in her ears as she fumbled for her car keys. Her phone buzzed. Rebecca again. Her third call today. Margaret sighed and answered. "Mom, what did Dr. Mitchell say?" "Surgery in 3 weeks, then radiation." Margaret kept her voice steady, the same tone she'd used to brief countless military doctors during her career. "Standard protocol. I can fly in from Houston." "No need. Focus on your work at NASA. I've got this handled." The line went quiet for a moment. "The medical bills, Mom, your insurance, expired last month when the hospital downsized." "I know." Margaret slid into her faded Toyota, the Arizona heat making the steering wheel nearly untouchable. "I've got some savings." Not enough, they both knew. The hospital's early retirement package had been more mandatory than optional, and at 56, Margaret found herself facing cancer with dwindling resources and no health coverage. "Let me help," Rebecca insisted. "You're just starting your career in aerospace engineering. I won't be a burden." Margaret ended the call as she pulled into traffic, the weight of uncertainty sitting heavy on her shoulders. 20 minutes later, her phone rang again. Unknown number. "Mrs. Reynolds, this is Martin Whitaker, attorney at law. I'm calling regarding the estate of Colonel Francis Reynolds." Margaret frowned. "My Uncle Frank, I haven't seen him since I was a child." "I understand. Nevertheless, you're his sole heir. Colonel Reynolds passed away 3 weeks ago, and his property in Cochise County has transferred to you. There are some matters requiring your attention, property taxes primarily." The attorney's voice continued, but Margaret's mind drifted to fragmented childhood memories of a tall, serious man in uniform who'd visit her father occasionally. The brothers had grown distant after Vietnam. Uncle Frank had never married, devoting himself to some classified work for the government. "How much are the taxes?" Margaret asked, interrupting the lawyer's monologue. The figure Whitaker quoted made her wince. "The property is approximately 200 acres with a main residence and several outbuildings. Quite remote. If you're interested in selling, I can refer you to—" "I'll need to see it first," Margaret said, surprising herself. She had no intention of keeping desert property, but something about liquidating her uncle's final possession without even seeing it felt wrong. "Of course, the address and keys will be available at the county assessor's office. I should mention that Colonel Reynolds was somewhat eccentric in his later years. The property reflects that." 3 days later, Margaret sat in the Cochise County assessor's office, examining a manila folder containing the deed to her unexpected inheritance. Across the desk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a nameplate reading Jane Martinez tapped at her computer. "You're Frank Reynolds' niece. Well, that's something. Most folks thought the colonel didn't have any family." "We weren't close," Margaret admitted. "What can you tell me about the property?" Jane leaned back in her chair. 200 acres of high desert, mostly undeveloped. The main house was built in the 70s, solid construction, military efficiency rather than comfort. Property taxes are significantly in arrears, I'm afraid. The lawyer mentioned that. Colonel Reynolds was well respected around here, but a bit of a mystery, kept to himself. Some folks called him Phantom Frank, would disappear for months, then suddenly be back tinkering with equipment in his workshop. Jane's expression softened. He passed peacefully, they say, found in his study with his logbooks. Margaret studied the topographical map in the folder. The property sat isolated at the end of a long access road surrounded by federal land. No neighbors for miles. Not much out there, but you and the rattlesnakes, Jane confirmed following Margaret's gaze. If you're planning to sell, there's limited market for such remote properties unless a developer wants to subdivide. I'll need to assess it first. An hour later, Margaret's Toyota struggled up an increasingly rough dirt road. The paved highway had given way to gravel, then to this rutted path that threatened her sedan's undercarriage with every bump. Heat waves shimmered across the landscape, distorting the distant mountains. After nearly 5 miles of tortuous driving, she crested a small rise and caught her first glimpse of the property. Unlike the ranch-style homes typical of the area, this was something else entirely. Low-slung and fortress-like, the main building resembled a military installation more than a residence. Constructed of reinforced concrete with narrow windows, it sat nestled against a rocky hillside as if part of the natural formation. Several smaller outbuildings, a workshop, storage shed, and what appeared to be a generator house clustered nearby. A tall antenna rose from behind the main structure, and solar panels glinted on the roof. The entire compound was surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. "What on earth were you up to out here, Uncle Frank?" Margaret murmured as she pulled up to the gate. The padlock yielded to a key from the county office. Margaret swung the gate open and drove through, raising a trail of dust that hung suspended in the still desert air. As she approached the main building, she noticed security cameras mounted at strategic points, unusual for a private residence, especially one this remote. The front door featured not just a standard lock, but a keypad. Margaret tried the numerical code included in the property documents, 0413, with no success. After several attempts, she noticed smaller numbers etched below the manufacturer's label, 19970. The lock clicked open when she entered them. Inside, the temperature dropped at least 20 degrees. Despite being unoccupied for weeks, the building maintained climate control. Emergency lighting activated automatically, illuminating a space that resembled a military command center more than a home. The main room contained institutional furniture, communications equipment, and walls lined with technical manuals. A faint hum indicated systems still running on backup power. Dust had settled on every surface, yet the space felt meticulously organized. No personal photographs adorned the walls, only framed technical schematics and what appeared to be mission patches from various NASA programs. One shadow box contained medals, Distinguished Service Cross Silver Star, and others Margaret recognized from her military career. A door led to a Spartan bedroom containing nothing but a neatly made bunk, a dresser, and more technical manuals. The kitchen was equally utilitarian, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. But it was the study that drew Margaret's attention. Unlike the other spaces, this room showed signs of a life beyond military precision. Bookshelves overflowed with volumes on aerospace engineering, astronomy, and military history. A large desk dominated the center, covered with papers and notebooks arranged in precise stacks. Behind it hung an enlarged photograph of 3 men standing before what appeared to be spacecraft components, her uncle flanked by 2 others in NASA jumpsuits. Margaret approached the desk, noting a leather-bound logbook open to an entry dated just weeks before April 13, 2023, 53 years since the oxygen tank rupture. Systems check on all Theta equipment completed. Filtration prototypes still functional after all this time. They built things to last in those days. Wonder if anyone will remember once I'm gone. She leafed through the logbook, finding meticulous records of maintenance procedures for equipment she couldn't identify. Technical terms and NASA acronyms filled the pages, along with occasional references to Theta protocol and contingency systems. The desk drawers contained more notebooks, technical specifications, and folders marked with dates corresponding to various Apollo missions. One drawer was locked. Margaret searched the desk blotter and found a small key taped beneath. Military style, always have backup access. Inside the locked drawer lay a single file folder stamped "Classified" in faded red ink. The cover page read Apollo 13 Operation Theta, with her uncle's name listed under primary technical lead. Before she could examine it further, a sharp knock at the front door startled her. Margaret quickly replaced the folder and moved to the entrance, surprised that anyone would venture this far into the desert unannounced. Through the narrow security window, she saw an elderly man leaning on a walking stick. Despite his age well into his 70s, he stood straight with the unmistakable bearing of military service. "You must be Frank's niece," he called through the door. "Bill Harmon. I live about 3 miles east. Saw the dust trail coming up the road." Margaret opened the door cautiously. "How did you know who I was?" "Frank mentioned you might come someday. Said his niece was a military nurse with auburn hair, just like her mother." Bill's weathered face creased in a smile. "Besides, not many strangers out this way, and Frank didn't get many visitors. You knew my uncle well." "Neighbors of sorts. Both of us preferred our solitude, but we helped each other out. I was a test pilot before retiring, kept his generator running. He kept my old truck operational." Bill glanced past her at the interior. "Place still running on auxiliary power, I see. Main generator probably needs priming after sitting idle." Margaret hesitated, then stepped aside. "Would you mind showing me? I'm not familiar with the systems here." Bill walked her through the property's sophisticated infrastructure over the next hour: a solar array with battery backup, satellite communications, water purification, and climate control designed for desert extremes. The engineering was impressive, far beyond typical residential needs. "Your uncle was meticulous about maintenance," Bill explained as they examined the generator house. "Said his work required reliable systems. Couldn't afford failures." "What exactly was his work?" Margaret asked. "These facilities seem excessive for a retired military officer." Bill's hands gnarled with arthritis, but still deft adjusted the generator's fuel intake. "Frank was Grumman primarily. Worked on the lunar module for the Apollo program. Brilliant engineer. After the moon landings ended, he consulted on various projects, some classified from what I gathered. Never discussed details. Grumman, the defense contractor. Aerospace division, they built the LM lunar module. Your uncle was part of the team that designed the systems. Critical components." The generator roared to life, and Bill nodded with satisfaction. "After Apollo 1, when those 3 astronauts died in the fire, NASA revamped everything. Frank was brought in as part of that effort." Margaret recalled the photograph in the study. "He worked directly with the astronauts. Some of them, especially the Apollo 13 crew. That mission changed him somehow. Became more focused after that. Started building this place not long after." As they walked back to the main building, Margaret noted details she'd missed earlier: the property's defensive positioning against the hillside, the overlapping fields of view from the security cameras, the reinforced construction. This wasn't just a home, it was a secure facility disguised as a residence. "Did he have visitors? Government officials?" Bill's expression turned guarded. "Occasionally, black SUVs would show up every few years, men in suits. Frank never introduced them, and I never asked." He glanced at the sun, now low on the horizon. "It'll be dark soon. You staying the night?" Margaret hadn't planned to, but the thought of navigating that treacherous road in darkness changed her mind. "I suppose I will." "Smart choice. Road's dangerous after dark. There's emergency supplies in the storage room, military-grade MREs and bottled water. Power should be stable now. Lock up tight." Bill handed her a piece of paper with a phone number. "No cell service out here, but Frank installed a satellite phone in the communications room. Call if you need anything." After Bill departed, Margaret explored the property more thoroughly. The workshop contained precision tools and electronic equipment she couldn't identify. The storage room held supplies sufficient for months of isolation, food, water, medical kits, and emergency equipment. As night fell across the desert, the property's external lighting activated, automatically illuminating the perimeter. Margaret returned to the study, drawn to the classified folder she'd discovered earlier. Sitting at her uncle's desk, she opened it carefully. Inside were technical documents, correspondence with NASA officials, and handwritten notes in her uncle's precise script. The top document was a letter dated April 1970, shortly after Apollo 13's near disaster. "Colonel Reynolds, your team's rapid development of the filtration system prototype proved invaluable during recent events. While public acknowledgement remains impossible due to Operation Theta's classification status, please accept my personal gratitude. Your work saved lives and preserved national capabilities during a critical period. The President has been briefed on your contribution. Theta protocol will continue under enhanced security measures." Your recommendation for distributed storage of critical technologies has been approved. With deepest appreciation, Thomas O. Payne, NASA Administrator. Beneath this were schematics for what appeared to be an air filtration system remarkably similar to the famous jury-rigged carbon dioxide scrubber that had helped save the Apollo 13 astronauts. But these designs predated the emergency with development timestamps from 1969, months before Apollo 13 launched. Margaret's medical background allowed her to grasp the basic principles. This was a prototype emergency life support system designed to remove carbon dioxide using minimal resources. The very technology that became famous when NASA engineers improvised a solution during Apollo 13's crisis. Except her uncle's team had already developed it as a contingency measure before the mission even launched. Further documents revealed Frank had been part of a specialized team called Theta Group, engineers tasked with developing emergency systems and backup technologies following the Apollo 1 tragedy. Their work remained classified, their contributions unacknowledged in official NASA histories. A photograph slipped from between the pages, her uncle standing alongside Neil Armstrong, both men in shirt sleeves examining equipment. The inscription read, "To Frank, Theta Group's finest. The ones who stay on the ground make it possible for the rest of us to flee me." Neil Armstrong, 1969. Margaret sat back processing this revelation. The uncle she barely knew had played a crucial, unrecognized role in America's space program, developing technologies that saved the Apollo 13 crew when disaster struck. Yet he'd lived in obscurity, his contributions hidden behind classification stamps and security protocols. Why had he built this fortified compound in the desert? Why maintain all this equipment decades after the Apollo program ended? The logbook entry suggested he'd continued maintaining something called the Theta Repository well into his final years. Other documents reference coordinates and storage locations throughout the property. Too exhausted to investigate further, Margaret prepared one of the military cots in a side room. Despite the property's strangeness, she felt an unexpected connection to this place and to the uncle she was only now beginning to know. Morning arrived with spectacular desert clarity, sunlight streaming through narrow windows. Margaret awoke disoriented before remembering where she was. After a sparse breakfast from the emergency supplies, she returned to the study determined to understand more about her uncle's work. A map in one of the logbooks caught her attention, a detailed survey of the property with locations marked by alphanumeric codes. One area behind the main building was circled in red labeled Primary Repository Access Theta 1. Margaret spent the morning exploring the exterior, searching for anything matching the map's designation. The area indicated appeared to be nothing but natural rock formation, a jutting ridge of reddish stone against which the main building had been constructed. Frustrated, she returned to the study and examined the map more carefully. Additional notations indicated Access Protocol 41370 with a small diagram of what looked like a keypad sequence. The date was familiar. April 13th, 1970, the day Apollo 13's oxygen tank exploded. Margaret went to the communications room and called Bill Harmon. "The repository," she said when he answered. "Did my uncle ever mention it to you?" A long pause followed. "You've been going through his files. I need to understand what I've inherited. There's a location marked on his property maps, but I can't find anything resembling an entrance or structure." Another pause. "Frank was very protective of his work. If you found his maps, you should also have found his access protocols." The date of the Apollo 13 accident. "I tried it on the exterior keypad by the stone ridge, but nothing happened." "That's because it's not just a keypad. There's a sequence." Bill's voice lowered. "Look, I promised Frank I wouldn't discuss certain things. But since you're his heir, the ridge isn't natural. It's a disguised entrance designed to withstand," he hesitated, "significant force. Military grade. The access point is beneath the southern outcropping. There's a rock that pivots when pressed correctly." Margaret thanked him and returned to the ridge. Examining it closely, she noticed one boulder that seemed slightly different from the others, the texture too uniform, the weathering too consistent. When she pressed it firmly, a seam appeared in the stone surface, revealing a sophisticated keypad and scanner. She entered the date 4/13/70 and placed her palm on the scanner. After a moment, a computerized voice responded, "Biometric variance detected. Secondary authentication required. Verbal password." Margaret stood perplexed. What password would her uncle have set? She tried his military service number, then Theta protocol, then Apollo 13. Each attempt was rejected. Returning to the study, she searched through more documents looking for clues. In the classified folder, she found a memo with a handwritten note in the margin. Remember Grissom's words, "If we die, we want people to accept it. We are in a risky business." Gus Grissom, one of the astronauts who died in the Apollo 1 fire. His words had become something of a mantra for NASA engineers working to prevent future tragedies. Margaret returned to the hidden entrance and tried again. When prompted for this verbal password, she spoke clearly. "We are in a risky business." The stone face slid open, revealing a descending stairway illuminated by emergency lighting. Cool air rushed upward, carrying the faint scent of metal and electronic equipment. Margaret hesitated only briefly before starting down the stairs. The passage led to a heavy blast door with another keypad. This time the code from her uncle's desk, 0413, worked immediately. The door opened with a pneumatic hiss, revealing what appeared to be an underground command center straight from the Cold War era. Banks of equipment lined the walls, computers, communication systems, and monitoring stations, all in surprisingly operational condition. Climate control kept the facility at a constant temperature and humidity. Emergency lighting cast everything in a soft blue glow until motion sensors triggered the main illumination system. But it was the center of the room that captured Margaret's attention. There, arranged on specially designed storage racks, sat what appeared to be aerospace components. Life support systems, control panels, and equipment modules bearing NASA and Grumman logos. Each piece was meticulously preserved, sealed in climate-controlled cases with detailed documentation attached. Moving through the facility in awe, Margaret examined the artifacts. One large case contained what appeared to be a prototype of the famous jury-rigged carbon dioxide scrubber from Apollo 13, but in a professionally engineered version, not the hasty assembly of duct tape and spare parts depicted in historical accounts and movies. A plaque beside it read, "Theta LiOH Filtration System Prototype, January 1969, designed for emergency CO2 removal during extended LM occupation. Implemented during Apollo 13 emergency, April 1970. Another case held what appeared to be a backup navigation system. Its documentation indicated it had been designed following concerns about primary system failures after Apollo 12 was struck by lightning during launch. Margaret's medical training helped her understand the life support systems, but other components remained mysterious. Clearly advanced technology for their era developed as emergency backups, but apparently never publicly deployed. At a workstation, she found a logbook with entries continuing to just weeks before her uncle's death. He had maintained this facility for over 50 years, preserving these artifacts and keeping the systems operational long after the Apollo program ended. But why build an elaborate underground bunker to store backup equipment from a space program that ended decades ago? A secure cabinet at the rear of the facility provided the first clue. Inside were files marked Theta Protocol, full authorization only. Using the key from her uncle's desk, Margaret opened them to find documents bearing the highest security classifications of their era. The opening page laid out the program's purpose. Operation Theta Contingency Preservation Protocol, established January 1968, following Apollo 1 disaster. Authorization National Security, Action Memorandum 4-13. Classification: Top Secret. Special access required. A primary objective: ensure preservation of critical spaceflight capabilities in the event of catastrophic system failure or national emergency. Secondary objective: maintain technological continuity through distributed storage of essential components, documentation, and expertise. In recognition of the strategic national importance of maintained space access capabilities during the current geopolitical climate, Operation Theta establishes secure repositories for critical technologies independent of primary NASA facilities. The document continued outlining a classified program established during the height of the Cold War to preserve America's space capabilities in case of disaster, natural or man-made. The Apollo 1 fire had demonstrated how quickly years of progress could be lost. In the shadow of the space race with the Soviet Union, contingency plans were developed to ensure America could quickly rebuild its space program if main facilities were compromised. Frank Reynolds had been among the program's key engineers, tasked with developing backup systems and preserving essential technologies in distributed, hardened facilities, this bunker being one of them. Additional files detailed the expanded scope following Apollo 13's near disaster. What had begun as a backup plan became a parallel development program, creating improved emergency systems that were quietly incorporated into later missions without public disclosure. As Margaret explored further, she discovered the facility extended beyond the main room. A secured door led to a larger storage area containing more substantial components, including what appeared to be critical elements of a lunar module environmental system and backup navigation equipment. Each artifact represented a piece of hidden space history technologies developed in secret contributions never acknowledged in official accounts. Her uncle had been part of a shadow team of engineers whose work had helped ensure mission success and, in the case of Apollo 13's survival itself. The final room contained the most stunning discovery, sealed containers marked lunar material contingency samples. Documentation indicated these were small, backup samples of moon rocks and dust preserved separately from the main NASA collection as part of the contingency protocol. Margaret sat at the facility's main console, overwhelmed by what she'd discovered. The historical and scientific value was incalculable. The market value, should these artifacts ever be sold, would easily reach millions. But the national security implications troubled her. These were classified materials preserved under a protocol she didn't fully understand. As a military veteran herself, she recognized the seriousness of encountering classified operations, even decades-old ones. Yet as Frank's heir, this facility and its contents were legally her property. Her phone alarm interrupted her thoughts. Time for medication. The reminder brought her back to her immediate reality: cancer treatment, medical bills, uncertain future. The inheritance she'd dismissed as a burden suddenly represented both opportunity and complication. Margaret climbed back to the surface, securing the bunker entrance behind her. The desert afternoon heat hit her like a physical barrier after hours in the climate-controlled facility below. She needed advice, someone who could help her understand the significance of what she'd found without immediately involving government authorities. Rebecca, her daughter, worked for NASA in Houston, specializing in environmental systems for future spacecraft. While too young to have any connection to Apollo, she would understand the technical and historical significance. Inside the main building, Margaret used the satellite phone to call her daughter. "Mom, where are you? I've been trying your cell for hours." "At Uncle Frank's property. There's no regular service here." Margaret hesitated. "Rebecca, I need your expertise on something. It's about NASA, Apollo-era technology." "Uncle Frank's place, I thought you were selling it." "That's complicated now. I've found something. An underground facility with preserved Apollo program artifacts, backup systems, prototypes, documentation. Things that aren't in the official record." Silence stretched across the connection. "Rebecca, Mom, if this is real, it's significant, historically and potentially legally. What kind of artifacts exactly?" "Life support systems, navigation equipment, even lunar material samples, all preserved in a hardened facility beneath the property. Uncle Frank was part of something called Operation Theta, a classified contingency program during the Apollo era." "This sounds unbelievable, I know, but I'm looking at the documentation. Uncle Frank maintained this facility until his death. There's a prototype of the carbon dioxide scrubber from Apollo 13, but it predates the mission. Like they had already developed the emergency solution before it was needed." Another long pause. "Mom, don't discuss this with anyone else. Don't post anything online. I need to make some calls discreetly. There are people at Johnson Space Center who would know about this if it's legitimate. Historians, engineers who've studied the Apollo program." "There's more," Margaret said. "Uncle Frank's role in Apollo 13 was apparently significant, but never publicly acknowledged. He was part of a team that developed emergency systems that were implemented during the crisis." "If that's true," Rebecca's voice had changed professional interest to overriding initial skepticism. "Mom, can you take photographs, detailed ones, of the equipment and documentation? But don't share them with anyone but me." "I can. But Rebecca, I need to figure out what to do with all this. The property taxes alone are beyond what I can afford, and with the medical bills coming. Let me make these calls first. If what you found is authentic, there are proper channels. Museums, NASA itself. But we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." After ending the call, Margaret returned to the bunker with her phone's camera. She spent hours photographing the equipment, documentation, and facility itself, creating a detailed record of everything she'd discovered. As evening approached, she returned to the main building exhausted but determined to learn more. In her uncle's study, she found a hidden compartment beneath the desk, a small safe with the same keypad code as the bunker entrance. Inside was a personal journal distinct from the technical logbooks. The journal revealed a different side of Frank Reynolds, not just the meticulous engineer, but a man driven by personal conviction. The earliest entries dated from January 1967, immediately following the Apollo 1 fire, Jan 30, 1967. Grissom, White, and Chaffee gone. The hatch design failed them. We failed them. Command module redesign will take months. The Russians will get ahead while we recover. General Simmons approached me today about contingency planning. If we can't prevent all failures, we must at least ensure we can recover from them. Theta Group is forming, 6 of us initially, operating parallel to primary program but independent, developing backup systems for every critical function. Later entries documented the evolution of Operation Theta from contingency planning to active development of backup technologies. November 12, 1969. Successful test of the LiOH filtration prototype today. Can maintain survivable CO2 levels for 96+ hours using materials available in both CM and LM. Theta storage facility construction proceeding on schedule. Repository Alpha will be operational before Apollo 13 launches. And then the entries from April 1970, April 13th, 1970. Oxygen tank explosion on Apollo 13. Switching to emergency protocols. Theta Group on standby. Our filtration system design is being implemented by Houston. Will it work in field conditions? The crew has hours before CO2 reaches critical levels. April 17th, 1970. They made it, our system worked, modified by the flight controllers using available materials, but the core design functioned as intended. Cannot describe the feeling of watching our contingency plans save lives. Theta protocol validated in the most dramatic fashion possible. Yet we remain in the shadows. Perhaps that's where we belong. The journal continued through the years, documenting Frank's ongoing work with NASA and defense contractors, always with references to maintaining the repository and preserving the technology. His dedication seemed to intensify rather than diminish with time, even as the Apollo program ended and public attention shifted elsewhere. The final entries reflected an aging man's concerns about his legacy. March 2, 2020. Repository maintenance completed. Systems functional after all these years. What happens to all this when I'm gone? Margaret might understand. Military background. Respects duty. Must update the will. The history here can't be lost, even if my role in it remains classified. His last entry dated just days before his death, April 13, 2023. 53 years since 13. Annual systems check complete. Left access protocols in the desk. Safe. If Margaret comes, she'll find them. Strange to think of these artifacts outliving their creators. History preserved in a bunker while the world moves on, forgetting how close we came to disaster. How thin the line between triumph and tragedy. My part was small, but necessary. Perhaps that's enough for one lifetime. Margaret closed the journal feeling the weight of her uncle's legacy. He had dedicated his life to a classified mission, his contributions unrecognized outside a small circle of insiders. Now that mission and its physical artifacts had passed to her. A knock at the door startled her from these thoughts. Through the security window, she saw Bill Harmon's weathered face. "You found it?" he said when she opened the door. Not a question. "You knew about the bunker all along." Bill nodded, leaning on his walking stick. "Help maintain the external systems." Never went inside. Frank was strict about access protocols. But I knew what it contained, generally speaking. "Why didn't you tell me this morning?" "Needed to see if you'd figure it out yourself. Frank said you were sharp military nurse problem solver. Said if anyone in his family would understand the importance of what he'd preserved, it would be you." Margaret let him in, leading him to the kitchen where she'd prepared coffee from the emergency supplies. "The journal mentions you. Says you were Air Force test pilot program before NASA recruited you. For a brief time, washed out of astronaut selection due to a minor heart murmur, ended up flying experimental aircraft instead. Met Frank during equipment testing for Apollo. Bill accepted the coffee with gnarled hands. We both retired out here. Like the isolation, the clean desert air. Good place for old men with classified histories. Were you also part of Operation Theta? Peripherally, tested some of their systems. Most of us only knew pieces of it, compartmentalized information. Frank was among the few who understood the entire operation. Why maintain it for 50 years after Apollo ended the Cold War is long over? Bill's expression grew serious. Is it nations still compete for space dominance? Technologies still have strategic value. Historical significance aside, some of what Frank preserved represents capabilities we might need again someday. But why here in a private bunker in the desert? Distributed storage was a core Theta principle. Don't keep all your eggs in one basket. NASA facilities could be targeted. Government repositories could be compromised. But who would look for critical space program artifacts in a private bunker on a retired engineer's property? Margaret considered this. The journal mentions other repositories. Alpha Beta, there were several originally. I don't know how many remain active. Frank maintained contact with a few other Theta engineers over the years. Most have passed now. A troubling thought occurred to her. If this facility contains classified technology, could I be in legal jeopardy for accessing it? Bill sipped his coffee before answering. Technically, you inherited the property and everything on it. But yes, the classification status complicates things. Frank intended for the historical record to be preserved, not hidden away forever. He left contingency plans for that too. What plans? In his final years, he corresponded with certain NASA historians and engineers, ones with appropriate security clearances. People who could help ensure these artifacts and records found their proper place without creating security concerns. Bill reached into his jacket and produced a business card. Dr. Robert Chen, former NASA engineer, now specializes in Apollo-era technology preservation, has the necessary clearances. Frank trusted him. Margaret took the card, noting the Houston address. My daughter works at Johnson Space Center. She's making inquiries. Carefully, I hope. Not everyone needs to know about this place immediately. As if on cue, the satellite phone rang. Rebecca's voice came through tense and excited. Mom, I've spoken with some colleagues very discreetly. Based on your photos, what you found appears authentic and significant. Historically unprecedented, actually. But there's something else you should know. What is it? 2 men came to my office today asking if I'd had recent contact with you. Said they were from NASA administration, but their credentials seemed off somehow. When I mentioned you'd inherited property in Arizona, they became very interested. Margaret met Bill's eyes. He shook his head slightly in warning. Did you tell them anything specific? Margaret asked. No, said I hadn't spoken with you in days. But Mom, they knew about Uncle Frank. Asked specifically if you'd accessed any storage facilities on his property. That's concerning. It gets stranger. After they left, I asked my director about them. He had no record of any administrative personnel visiting from headquarters today. Mom, I think you need to be careful. After ending the call, Margaret turned to Bill. Someone knows about this place, and they're looking for me. Frank always said this might happen eventually. The remaining Theta personnel monitored each other's security protocol. Someone must have detected your access to the bunker systems. What do they want? To secure classified material, most likely, or perhaps ensure you understand the sensitivity of what you've found. Bill stood moving to the window to scan the property. We should accelerate the documentation process. Contact Dr. Chen immediately. Having proper historical authorities involved will help legitimize your position. Margaret used the satellite phone to call the number on the card. After identifying herself as Frank Reynolds' niece, she was put through immediately. Mrs. Reynolds, Dr. Chen's voice carried the slight accent of someone who had learned English as a second language decades ago. I've been expecting your call. Colonel Reynolds informed me of his contingency plans should anything happen to him. You knew my uncle? We worked together during the later Apollo missions. I was a junior engineer then, but our paths crossed through Operation Theta. May I ask if you've accessed the repository? Margaret hesitated, looking at Bill, who nodded encouragement. Yes, today. It's remarkable. Indeed, what Colonel Reynolds preserved represents a significant historical archive, one that fills crucial gaps in our understanding of the Apollo program's technical evolution. I would very much like to examine it with your permission. Dr. Chen's someone and is already looking for me in connection with this facility. People with questionable credentials approached my daughter at Johnson Space Center today. A long pause followed. That is concerning but not entirely unexpected. Certain elements within the intelligence community have maintained interest in Theta materials, not all with appropriate authorization. Are you saying government agents might try to seize these artifacts? It's complex. The classification status of Theta materials has never been officially resolved. Some argue the information should remain restricted. Others believe the historical value outweighs security concerns after so many years. Dr. Chen's voice lowered. Colonel Reynolds dedicated his final years to ensuring these materials would eventually become part of the public historical record, properly contextualized. What should I do? Document everything thoroughly. I can fly to Arizona tomorrow to provide expert assessment. Having established historical authorities involved will strengthen your position as custodian of these artifacts. He paused. And Mrs. Reynolds, until I arrive, I would suggest maintaining heightened security awareness. After ending the call, Margaret turned to Bill. He's coming tomorrow. Seems to support preserving the historical record rather than reclassifying everything. Frank would approve. He wanted recognition for the Theta engineers eventually, not for glory, but for historical accuracy. As evening settled over the desert, Margaret felt the weight of her unexpected responsibility. What had begun as a burdensome inheritance had transformed into something far more significant, a hidden chapter of America's space history preserved by her uncle's decades of dedicated service. She spent the night in the main building, reviewing more of Frank's documents, developing a deeper understanding of Operation Theta and her uncle's role in it. The filtration system prototype that had helped save Apollo 13 was just one example of Theta Group's contributions. They had developed numerous backup systems and contingency technologies that were quietly incorporated into the space program without public acknowledgement. Morning brought the distant sound of vehicles approaching. Through binoculars, Margaret observed two black SUVs navigating the access road government issue by their appearance, though unmarked. We have company, she told Bill, who had stayed overnight in one of the auxiliary rooms. He joined her at the window, frowning at the approaching vehicles. Earlier than I expected. Dr. Chen won't arrive for hours yet. Who are they? Could be legitimate NASA security, could be an intelligence community. Either way, they'll want access to the repository. Should we deny them? Bill considered this. Not directly, but we can control the narrative. You're the legal property owner investigating your inheritance. You've already contacted appropriate historical authorities. Be cooperative but firm about your ownership rights. The SUVs pulled up outside the main building. 4 men emerged, 2 in each vehicle. They wore casual clothing rather than suits, but their military-style bearing was unmistakable. The oldest, a gray-haired man with the weathered complexion of someone who had spent considerable time in desert environments, approached the door and knocked firmly. Margaret opened it, maintaining a composed expression. Can I help you, Mrs. Reynolds? Thomas Carter, NASA Security Division. He presented identification that looked official, though Margaret had no way to verify its authenticity. We understand you have recently inherited this property from Colonel Francis Reynolds. That's correct. May I ask how you knew I was here? Carter's expression remained neutral. Colonel Reynolds' property has been of interest to NASA for some time, given his historical connection to the space program. We were notified of his passing and have been monitoring the property transfer process. I see. And what brings NASA security to my door this morning? We have reason to believe this property may contain historically significant artifacts and documentation related to the Apollo program. As part of our historical preservation mandate, we'd like to inventory any such materials. Margaret noted the careful phrasing, no direct mention of classified information or the underground facility. What a coincidence. I've just arranged for Dr. Robert Chen, a NASA historical consultant, to examine some interesting items I've found in my uncle's possession. He's flying in today. Carter's expression flickered briefly, surprise, perhaps irritation. Dr. Chen is indeed a respected authority, but our department has primary jurisdiction over Apollo-era artifacts with potential security implications. Security implications? I thought you mentioned historical preservation. The standoff was interrupted by Bill emerging from behind Margaret. Thomas, been a while. Carter's eyes narrowed. Harmon, didn't realize you were still in the area. Hard to kill old desert rats like me. Bill's tone was conversational, but his posture had stiffened. Mrs. Reynolds has followed proper protocols, secured the property, contacted authorized historical personnel, maintained site integrity, just as Frank would have wanted. Protocol would have required immediate notification of NASA security upon discovery of restricted materials. And which materials would those be specifically, Margaret asked. My understanding is that I've inherited my uncle's personal property, including his engineering archives. If there are specific items of concern, perhaps you could clarify their status. The verbal chess match continued on the doorstep, neither side directly acknowledging the bunker's existence, while both clearly aware of it. Finally, Carter changed tactics. Mrs. Reynolds, you may not be aware of the classified nature of certain aspects of your uncle's work. We're simply here to our national security protocols are maintained while also preserving historical artifacts properly. I understand completely, Margaret replied. My military background has given me great appreciation for security protocols. That's precisely why I've contacted Dr. Chen, who possesses the appropriate clearances to assess these materials. Carter seemed to recognize he wouldn't gain immediate access without escalating to measures he wasn't prepared to implement. We'll return tomorrow with Dr. Chen then. In the meantime, I must emphasize the importance of maintaining strict confidentiality regarding anything you may have discovered on this property. After the visitors departed, Bill released a tense breath. They'll be back with more authority next time. Who exactly are they? You seem to know Carter. Former intelligence community now attached to NASA security in some capacity. They monitor sites and personnel connected to certain classified programs. Not necessarily hostile, but they prioritize security over historical preservation. Will they try to confiscate everything? They'll want to. Whether they have legal authority is another question. That's why having Dr. Chen involved is crucial. He represents the historical preservation perspective within NASA. Margaret gazed out at the desert landscape, understanding more clearly her uncle's choice of location, isolated, defensible, far from prying eyes. The perfect place to preserve secrets for decades. We need to finish documenting everything before they return, she decided. And I want to understand exactly what's in that bunker and why it matters so much. They descended into the underground facility again, this time with a more systematic approach to documentation. Margaret photographed every artifact, every document, creating a comprehensive record that couldn't be easily disputed or erased. Among the technical components, she discovered something unexpected, a sealed case containing what appeared to be a mission chronograph, one of the watches worn by Apollo astronauts. The documentation indicated it had been worn during training by the Apollo 13 crew, then modified with Theta group improvements and maintained as a backup. The watch, a piece of space history in itself, had a handwritten note attached in what appeared to be astronaut Jim Lovell's handwriting. To Frank and the Theta team, some heroes work behind the scenes. Thanks for the save. This personal artifact, more than the technical components, brought home the human reality of her uncle's work. Behind the classified programs and engineering specifications were people, astronauts, whose lives depended on these systems, engineers who worked in anonymity to ensure mission success. As Margaret carefully photographed the watch and its documentation, Bill called down from the entrance. Vehicle approaching, single-car civilian. Might be Dr. Chen. They secured the facility and returned to the surface. The approaching vehicle was indeed a rental car from which emerged an elderly Asian-American man carrying a briefcase. Despite his age well into his 70s, Dr. Robert Chen moved with energy and purpose. Mrs. Reynolds, he greeted Margaret with a firm handshake. Thank you for contacting me. And Bill Harmon, it's been many years. Too many, Robert. Good to see you still upright. After brief introductions, Margaret led Dr. Chen to the study where she had arranged some of the documentation she'd found. His eyes widened as he examined the classified folders. Remarkable preservation, he murmured. Frank always was meticulous. He looked up at Margaret. I understand you've accessed the primary repository. Yes, it's extensive, and apparently of great interest to NASA security, who paid us a visit this morning. Dr. Chen's expression turned serious. Not unexpected, the Theta repositories have been subjects of internal debate for years. Some officials believe all materials should remain classified indefinitely. Others argue their historical significance outweighs security concerns after so many decades. What's your position? As a historian of the space program, I believe these artifacts and documents belong in appropriate museums and archives with proper historical context, particularly now as the last of the Apollo generation passes away. He set down the folder he'd been examining. I worked with your uncle to develop a preservation plan for these materials, one that respects both security considerations and historical significance. What kind of plan? Documentation, authentication, and appropriate placement. The Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum has a secure facility for sensitive aerospace artifacts. Other materials would go to the NASA archives or academic institutions with appropriate security clearances. And my role in this, as legal owner of these artifacts, you have certain rights, even regarding classified materials. Your uncle hoped you would serve as custodian during the transition process, ensuring the collection remains intact rather than being dispersed or reclassified entirely. Margaret considered this. These men who visited today, Carter and his team, seem more interested in securing everything than preserving history. Thomas Carter represents elements within the security establishment who prefer that certain aspects of the space program remain hidden, but he doesn't have unilateral authority. What happens when they return tomorrow? Dr. Chen opened his briefcase and removed several official-looking documents. I've brought authorization from the NASA administrator and the Smithsonian Institution to conduct a preliminary historical assessment of Colonel Reynolds's archives. This grants us temporary protection while we document the collection. Will that be enough? It establishes the historical significance of these materials and initiates a formal review process that can't be easily circumvented. It won't prevent them from eventually securing classified components, but it ensures the historical record will be preserved. Before they could discuss further, Bill called from the window. We've got company again. Same SUVs from this morning. Dr. Chen straightened his jacket. Earlier than expected, let me handle the initial conversation. My NASA credentials should help establish our position. Carter appeared unsurprised to find Dr. Chen already present when Margaret opened the door. Dr. Chen, I wasn't aware you'd been officially engaged in this matter. The NASA Historical Division and Smithsonian Institution have a standing interest in Apollo-era artifacts, Agent Carter, particularly those associated with previously undocumented aspects of the program. He presented his authorization papers. I've been asked to conduct a preliminary assessment of Colonel Reynolds' collection. Carter examined the documents with a frown. These don't override security protocols for classified materials. They establish a formal historical review process which must be completed before any disposition decisions. As you're aware, materials of this vintage require contextual evaluation to determine their current security status. The technical language seemed to temporarily stymie Carter. He turned to Margaret. Mrs. Reynolds, we still need to inspect the property to ensure all sensitive materials are properly secured. Of course, Margaret replied calmly. Though as the legal property owner, I'll need to accompany you during any inspection. What followed was a careful dance of authority and jurisdiction. Carter and his team were permitted to verify the bunker's security systems, but not remove or extensively document its contents. Dr. Chen's NASA credentials and formal authorization established enough bureaucratic complication to prevent immediate action. After several tense hours, Carter departed with his team clearly frustrated but unable to override the historical preservation protocols Dr. Chen had initiated. His parting words to Margaret carried clear warning. This matter isn't resolved, Mrs. Reynolds. National security considerations ultimately supersede historical interest. When they were alone again, Dr. Chen turned to Margaret with a grave expression. We've bought time, but not much. Carter will return with higher authorization. We need to complete our documentation and initiate formal historical registration for these artifacts immediately. How long will that take? Several days at minimum. The bunker contains more significant material than I anticipated. Your uncle preserved not just components and documents, but an entire untold chapter of the Apollo program. Margaret thought of her daughter's warning, the approaching medical treatments, the property taxes coming due. What had begun as an unwanted inheritance had become an unexpected mission, preserving her uncle's legacy in an important piece of space history. Dr. Chen, there's something else you should know. She hesitated, then continued. I'm facing some significant medical challenges. Cancer treatment beginning in 3 weeks. limited financial resources. I accepted this inheritance without understanding its significance, but now, the elderly engineer nodded understanding. Your uncle anticipated this possibility. In his final correspondence with me, he mentioned a contingency fund established to maintain the repository and provide for its proper historical preservation. I believe you'll find documentation in his financial records. A search through Frank's office revealed a folder containing trust documents, a substantial account established for historical preservation and family contingencies. The trust had remained untouched for decades, accumulating significant value. As his sole heir, Margaret had inherited this as well, though it came with specific provisions regarding the Theta artifacts. He thought of everything, Margaret murmured, examining the documents. Maintained this facility for 50 years, preserved historical artifacts. Most people don't even know exist in established funding to ensure it would continue after he was gone. Frank Reynolds was a contingency planner by nature and profession, Dr. Chen said with a small smile. He understood that preservation requires resources and forethought. The trust would cover the property taxes and provide significant financial support, including medical expenses for family members, but required commitment to the proper historical preservation of the Theta collection. It represented both opportunity and responsibility. As sunset painted the desert in golden hues, Margaret stood outside the main building, considering her unexpected inheritance. Beyond the financial implications lay something more profound, a connection to her uncle she'd never had in life, and through him, to a hidden chapter of American achievement. The artifacts in the bunker represented not just engineering ingenuity, but human dedication, the commitment of people like Frank Reynolds who worked in anonymity to ensure mission success and astronaut safety. Their contributions, classified and unacknowledged, had helped make possible one of humanity's greatest adventures. Her military nursing career had ended abruptly, but perhaps this was a different kind of service, preserving history that might otherwise be lost, ensuring recognition for those who had worked in the shadows of the space program. Tomorrow would bring more challenges. Carter would return, the documentation process would continue, decisions about her medical treatment and future plans would need to be made. But tonight, standing under the vast Arizona sky, where her uncle had maintained his solitary mission for decades, Margaret Reynolds felt a growing sense of purpose. This inheritance wasn't just a desert property or even the valuable artifacts beneath it. It was a mission preserving a legacy of American ingenuity, dedication, and the quiet heroism of engineers who had helped make space exploration possible. As the first stars appeared overhead, the same stars toward which the Apollo astronauts had journeyed, Margaret made her decision. She would see this through, honor her uncle's lifetime of service, and ensure this hidden chapter of space history took its rightful place in the national memory. The desert wind whispered across the property, a place of secrets, no longer. The desert sunrise painted the eastern sky in bands of amber and gold as Margaret stood at the bunker entrance, watching Dr. Chen methodically photograph and catalog each artifact. His movements were precise, almost reverent, the care of a historian handling treasures long thought lost. Beneath the main chamber, they had discovered a second level accessible through a reinforced hatch. This lower section contained even more sensitive materials: prototype guidance systems, experimental life support components, and documentation marked with security classifications Margaret had never seen during her military career. Dr. Chen adjusted his glasses as he examined a component labeled LM Environmental Backup Theta Configuration. The device resembled the environmental control systems from the lunar module, but with significant modifications. This is extraordinary. A completely redesigned oxygen recycling system developed after the Apollo 1 fire, but before Apollo 13. The official NASA records show nothing about this alternative design. Margaret studied the component. Her medical background helped her understand the basic principles. This system could maintain breathable atmosphere longer than the standard equipment, with redundancies that might have prevented the Apollo 13 crisis entirely. Why wasn't this system implemented in the actual spacecraft? Weight considerations, most likely. Every pound mattered for lunar missions. This system appears more robust, but heavier than the flight versions. Classic engineering trade-off: reliability versus payload capacity. Bill Harmon's voice came through the communication system they'd established between the bunker and the main building. "Margaret, we have visitors approaching, not Carter's team. Different vehicles, civilian SUV, and what looks like a government sedan. We'll be right up. They secured the lower level and ascended to the surface. Through the security monitors, Margaret observed a silver Suburban and black Ford sedan approaching the property gate. The vehicles stopped at the perimeter, and three individuals emerged: a middle-aged woman in a blazer and two men who moved with the unmistakable bearing of federal agents. "Any idea who they are?" Margaret asked Bill. "The woman looks like Diana Foster, NASA Legal Department. Dealt with her during some of Frank's later correspondence with headquarters. Straight shooter from what I recall." Dr. Chen nodded. "Diana has been supportive of historical preservation efforts. Her presence might indicate headquarters is taking a more balanced approach than Carter's security team." Margaret opened the gate remotely, allowing the vehicles to approach the main building. The visitors parked alongside Dr. Chen's rental car, and the woman in the blazer approached first, extending her hand. "Mrs. Reynolds, Diana Foster, NASA Office of General Counsel. Thank you for allowing us onto the property. I understand you've been having some complicated discussions with our security division. That's putting it mildly. May we come in? I believe we can find a more productive path forward than what Agent Carter has been pursuing." Inside, Diana introduced her companions, a Department of Energy security liaison and a State Department representative with responsibilities for technology classification reviews. Their presence underscored the seriousness with which NASA was treating the situation. "Mrs. Reynolds, I've reviewed Dr. Chen's preliminary report on Colonel Reynolds' collection. The historical significance appears substantial. However, we still have legitimate security concerns about certain classified technologies. I understand that, but this property and its contents were legally inherited. My uncle maintained this facility for decades with apparent authorization. Operation Theta's authorization was complex." Diana placed a folder on the table. "The program was established through National Security Action Memorandums during the Cold War. Its classification status was never formally resolved after the program ended, which means there's ambiguity about current jurisdiction. Multiple agencies claim interest in different aspects of the collection. That's why I've brought representatives from key departments to establish a coordinated approach." Dr. Chen interjected. "Diana, you know as well as I do that the historical value of these artifacts is immeasurable. Colonel Reynolds preserved technologies and documentation that fill crucial gaps in our understanding of the Apollo program. I don't dispute that, Robert, but some of these technologies still have national security implications even decades later, particularly the guidance systems in certain environmental components." The Department of Energy representative leaned forward. "Our specific concern involves power systems developed for extended lunar habitation. Colonel Reynolds' documentation suggests Theta Group developed miniaturized energy sources with potential dual-use applications." Margaret recognized the bureaucratic dance underway, each agency staking claims to different aspects of her uncle's collection while avoiding direct confrontation. Unlike Carter's heavy-handed approach, this was sophisticated institutional maneuvering. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. Diana outlined a compromise, a formal evaluation process involving both security experts and historical preservation specialists. The most sensitive technologies would undergo classification review, while historical documentation and less sensitive artifacts would be prepared for eventual museum display. During this process, you would retain legal ownership but grant access to authorized personnel. The evaluation would take approximately 3 months, after which we would present recommendations for permanent disposition. And if I refuse, the State Department representative cleared his throat. "Mrs. Reynolds, we prefer a cooperative approach. But multiple federal statutes govern classified technologies regardless of how they came into private possession." The implied threat was clear, though diplomatically phrased. "I need to consider this proposal," Margaret said, "and discuss it with my advisors." "Of course, we'll give you until tomorrow morning. In the meantime, we've established a security perimeter around the property, purely protective, I assure you. Given the value of these materials, we want to ensure no unauthorized access." After the visitors departed, Margaret checked the security monitors. Sure enough, unmarked vehicles had positioned themselves at strategic points along the property boundary. Not obviously threatening, but definitely limiting their options. "They're closing the net," Bill observed, more diplomatically than Carter would, but with the same objective: securing the Theta materials. Dr. Chen looked troubled. Diana is sincere about historical preservation, but she represents NASA's institutional interests. Their compromise still places security considerations above historical documentation. Margaret studied the proposal documents. What happens to the artifacts they deem too sensitive for public acknowledgement? Likely permanent classified storage in government facilities. The historical context would be lost, the Theta Group's contributions once again hidden from the historical record. This outcome seemed contrary to her uncle's intentions. Frank had maintained this facility independently for decades, preserving not just technologies, but the story of their development and the people behind them. There must be another approach that respects both security concerns and historical significance. Dr. Chen hesitated. There is a possibility. Your uncle mentioned contingency protocols in his final correspondence. Instructions for a situation where governmental agencies might attempt to reclaim the collection. What kind of protocols? He never specified details. Said the information was in the repository accessible only through specific command sequences. Margaret returned to the bunker accompanied by Dr. Chen. In the main control room, they examined the computer systems Frank had maintained and upgraded over decades. The interfaces were surprisingly modern. Her uncle had continually updated the technology while preserving the historical artifacts. Try searching for contingency protocols, Dr. Chen suggested. The system required biometric authentication. Margaret's inheritance status had apparently been programmed into the security parameters. After verification, she accessed a protected directory labeled Final Contingencies Authorized Access Only. The files contained detailed instructions, procedures for secure data transfer, contact information for trusted individuals with appropriate security clearances, and protocols for emergency relocation of critical artifacts. Frank had anticipated this very situation and prepared accordingly. He documented everything, Margaret marveled. Not just the technologies, but their historical context and significance, and established secure channels to ensure this record wouldn't be lost, even if the physical artifacts were reclaimed. Your uncle understood the value of historical truth, Dr. Chen said quietly, especially for a program that operated in shadows. The contingency files included something unexpected: video testimonials from Theta Group engineers recorded over the years as they aged, describing their work and its significance. Frank had collected these personal accounts, creating an oral history archive of the classified program. Margaret played one recording, an elderly engineer describing how Theta Group had developed backup environmental systems following the Apollo 1 fire. After we lost Grissom, White, and Chaffee, everything changed. NASA publicly redesigned the command module, but Theta Group was working on parallel systems backups for every critical function. The oxygen filtration system that saved Apollo 13 wasn't improvised from scratch like the official story claims. We had developed those principles months earlier, created prototypes, tested them extensively. When the crisis hit, our designs were implemented using available materials. The duct tape and cardboard made a better story for the press, but the engineering principles came from Theta. Other testimonials revealed similar discrepancies between official accounts and classified reality contingency systems developed in secret backup technologies, tested but never publicly acknowledged emergency protocols that influence mission decisions behind the scenes. This is what Frank was truly preserving, Dr. Chen realized. Not just the artifacts, but the complete historical record, the contributions of engineers who worked without recognition, the parallel development programs that provided crucial safety margins. Their exploration was interrupted by an alert from the security system. Bill's voice came through the communication link. Margaret, we have a situation. Rebecca has arrived at the property perimeter, but security personnel are refusing her entry. Rebecca, she's supposed to be in Houston. Apparently not anymore. Security is checking her identification now. Margaret hurried back to the surface. Through the monitors, she could see her daughter engaged in heated discussion with men in unmarked tactical gear. The protective perimeter, Diana Foster had mentioned. Override the gate controls, Margaret instructed Bill. She's immediate family and has clearance through my inheritance status. The gate opened, allowing Rebecca's rental car to proceed to the main building. Her daughter emerged looking travel-worn and agitated. Mom, what's going on? There are federal agents surrounding this property, and no one would tell me anything until I practically shoved my NASA credentials in their faces. It's complicated. Why are you here? I thought you were staying in Houston. After those men came asking questions, I got worried. Then my division chief called me into his office, said I was being placed on administrative leave pending a security review. Something about potential exposure to classified historical materials. They took my work laptop, restricted my badge access. Whatever's happening here has ripples reaching all the way to Johnson Space Center. This escalation concerned Margaret deeply. The authorities were not just securing the Theta repository, but constraining anyone connected to it, including her daughter's professional standing at NASA. Inside, Rebecca was astonished by Dr. Chen's presence. Dr. Chen, you're involved in this too. I cited your papers on Apollo-era environmental systems in my graduate thesis. Your mother has made a historically significant discovery, Ms. Reynolds, one that certain elements within the government would prefer to keep classified. Margaret brought Rebecca up to speed on the situation, the Theta repository, the competing government interests, and the compromise proposal from NASA legal representatives. They're establishing control using bureaucratic methods, Rebecca observed. Multiple agencies, overlapping jurisdictions, classification reviews that could take years. Classic containment strategy. You've seen this approach before in historical cases. When NASA wants to limit information about certain programs, they don't deny access outright. They create procedural mazes so complex that most researchers eventually give up. Dr. Chen nodded agreement. The strategy preserves deniability while achieving effective classification. No single person makes the decision to suppress information. The system itself creates the outcome. Rebecca examined the NASA legal proposal. This is cleverly constructed. By agreeing to this evaluation process, you'd essentially surrender control while appearing to maintain ownership rights. What would you recommend? Margaret asked. We need leverage, something that ensures they can't simply classify everything and walk away. The historical record needs protection. Frank's contingency protocols might provide that leverage, Dr. Chen suggested. He established secure data repositories and documentation that would be difficult to completely suppress. As they discussed strategy, Bill called from the security station. We've got movement at the perimeter, multiple vehicles approaching from the county road. The monitor showed a concerning development, 3 black SUVs accompanied by larger transport vehicles with government markings. That's not just a security team, Rebecca observed. Those transports are equipped for sensitive materials extraction. They're preparing to move the collection. Diana said we had until morning to consider their proposal. Apparently, someone has accelerated the timeline. Margaret made a quick decision. Rebecca helped Dr. Chen implement Frank's data contingency protocols, ensure the historical documentation is secured through his established channels. Bill and I will try to slow down whatever's happening outside. At the property entrance, Margaret confronted a team led by a familiar figure, Agent Carter, now accompanied by personnel in tactical gear and specialists with equipment cases. Mrs. Reynolds, I have authorization to secure classified materials on these premises immediately. Carter presented official-looking documents bearing multiple agency seals. This contradicts the arrangement proposed by NASA legal counsel this morning. We were given until tomorrow to respond. Circumstances have changed. We have credible intelligence suggesting foreign interest in this location. National security protocols now take precedence. Margaret doubted this convenient intelligence, but recognized the futility of challenging armed federal agents at her property gate. Instead, she employed a delaying tactic. I'll need to verify these orders with Diana Foster before granting access to the repository. Mrs. Reynolds, these orders supersede previous arrangements. We are authorized to proceed with or without cooperation. Then you'll need to exercise that authority explicitly, Agent Carter. As legal property owner, I am formally requesting verification from NASA General Counsel before permitting access. The bureaucratic chess move forced Carter to pause. Overriding a property owner's rights without clear justification could create legal complications later. He stepped aside to make calls while his team remained at the perimeter. Inside the main building, Margaret found Rebecca and Dr. Chen working rapidly to implement Frank's contingency protocols. They had connected secure drives to the repository's computer systems, downloading the historical documentation and personal testimonials. How much longer? Margaret asked. 10 minutes to complete the primary data transfer, Rebecca replied. But there's something else you need to see. Something we found in the lower-level archives, it changes everything about Operation Theta. In the bunker's secure communication room, Rebecca displayed documents they had discovered hidden behind a false panel files even more classified than the main collection. These records revealed Theta Group's true origins and broader mission scope. Operation Theta wasn't just about backup systems for Apollo missions, Rebecca explained. It was established as a contingency program for maintaining American space capabilities during potential nuclear conflict with the Soviet Union. The documents detailed plans developed at the height of the Cold War, distributed technology repositories, backup launch capabilities, and preserved expertise that could reconstitute America's space program if primary NASA facilities were compromised or destroyed. The Apollo missions were historic achievements, but they were also demonstrations of technological superiority during the Cold War, Dr. Chen explained. The ability to reach the moon represented missile accuracy, computer sophistication, and engineering precision that had profound strategic implications. Operation Theta was insurance, Rebecca continued. If tensions with the Soviets had escalated to nuclear exchange, these distributed facilities contained the knowledge and key technologies needed to rebuild America's space capabilities afterward. This revelation transformed Margaret's understanding of her uncle's lifetime work. Frank hadn't just been preserving historical artifacts. He had been maintaining a critical national asset, a technological safety deposit box for American space capabilities during the most dangerous period of the Cold War. This explains the multi-agency interest, Margaret realized. These aren't just historical items, they represent strategic technological preservation. And why certain elements want this facility's existence kept classified, Dr. Chen added. The concept of distributed technological preservation remains relevant in modern security planning. Bill's voice interrupted through the communication system. They're moving in. Carter got whatever authorization he needed, multiple teams approaching the main building. Margaret made a rapid decision. Complete the data transfer. Ensure the historical record is preserved through Frank's secure channels. We can't prevent them from taking the physical artifacts, but we can protect the historical truth. As federal agents entered the main building, Margaret met them in the central room maintaining a composed demeanor despite the intrusion. Agent Carter, I see you've obtained your authorization. National Security Directive Mrs. Reynolds will need access to the repository immediately. Of course, though I should mention that comprehensive documentation of all artifacts and their historical context has already been secured through appropriate channels. Any attempt to classify this material now would be addressing only the physical items, not the historical record. Carter's expression tightened. What channels? My uncle established contingency protocols decades ago, secure documentation preserved with prominent historians and institutions protected by legal stipulations that would release the information publicly under certain circumstances. This was partially a bluff, but based on what they'd discovered about Frank's preparations. The uncertainty it created was evident in Carter's hesitation. Diana Foster arrived looking displeased with the accelerated timeline. Agent Carter, this operation was not approved through proper NASA channels. Mrs. Reynolds was guaranteed time to consider our proposal. New intelligence necessitated immediate action. The authorization comes directly from combined agency leadership. The bureaucratic confrontation provided additional time for Rebecca and Dr. Chen to complete the data transfer. When Margaret finally led the federal team to the repository entrance, the critical historical documentation had been secured through Frank's established channels. The federal specialists began systematically documenting and preparing artifacts for removal, while Diana Foster attempted to maintain some semblance of the originally proposed process. Mrs. Reynolds, despite these circumstances, NASA remains committed to proper historical evaluation of these materials. I will personally ensure that Dr. Chen has appropriate access during the review process. In the communications room, now under federal observation, Rebecca accessed one final set of files from the repository system, Frank's personal records regarding Apollo 13. What they revealed stunned everyone present. The Apollo 13 oxygen tank explosion wasn't an accident, Rebecca said quietly, reading from the secure files. According to Uncle Frank's records, it was a deliberate act of sabotage. The room fell silent. Even Agent Carter stopped to listen. That's impossible, Diana responded. The investigation determined it was a manufacturing defect combined with procedural errors during ground testing. That was the official finding, Rebecca confirmed. But these records tell a different story. Theta Group conducted their own classified investigation and discovered evidence of tampering specifically designed to trigger a failure outside Earth orbit when abort options would be most limited. She displayed technical schematics and investigation notes from Frank's files. The documentation was meticulous, showing how subtle modifications to the tank's thermostat could cause precisely the kind of failure that occurred. According to these records, the sabotage was traced to a Soviet intelligence operation targeting the Apollo program. The manufacturing facility had been infiltrated by an agent who made modifications to specific components. Chen examined the documentation with growing concern. I remember rumors, whispers among certain engineers, but nothing was ever confirmed officially. Because it never became official, Rebecca continued displaying more documents. The National Security Council made a deliberate decision to maintain the accident narrative. Revealing Soviet sabotage of Apollo 13 during that period could have dangerously escalated Cold War tensions, potentially forcing a military response. Margaret understood the implications immediately. So Theta Group's emergency systems didn't just save the astronauts by coincidence, they were implemented because there had been ongoing concerns about potential sabotage. Exactly. After Apollo 1, Theta Group wasn't just developing contingency technologies, they were quietly implementing counterintelligence measures throughout the program. The filtration system that saved Apollo 13 had been developed specifically because they suspected Soviet attempts to compromise life support systems. This revelation transformed the historical significance of everything in the repository, not just backup technologies and classified engineering achievements, but evidence of a secret aspect of the Cold War, Soviet attempts to sabotage American space achievements, and the classified countermeasures that had prevented disaster. These records would completely rewrite our understanding of Apollo 13, Dr. Chen said. Not just a triumph of American ingenuity in crisis, but a successful defense against deliberate sabotage, a national security victory kept classified for diplomatic reasons. Agent Carter studied the documentation with professional interest. If authenticated, this information would have significant implications for current security protocols at aerospace facilities. Certain vulnerabilities identified during the Theta investigation might still be relevant. This is precisely why Frank preserved everything so meticulously, Margaret realized. Not just for historical accuracy, but because the lessons learned might still protect American space capabilities today. The revelation created a subtle shift in the room's dynamics. What had been a straightforward security operation to reclaim classified materials now involved potential intelligence of current relevance. The Theta repository wasn't just historical artifacts. It contained security insights that might still apply to modern space programs. Diana Foster recognized the changed situation. This clearly requires a more nuanced approach than immediate removal and classification. These materials need proper evaluation by both historical and security experts. Over the next hours, a more balanced process emerged. The most sensitive technologies would be transported to secure government facilities, but with formal agreements ensuring Dr. Chen and other historical experts would have continued access. The documentation and historical context would be preserved rather than classified out of existence. As federal teams carefully packed artifacts for transport, Margaret stood in the main room of her uncle's fortress-like home watching a half-century of secret history being cataloged and removed. The property would remain hers, but its hidden purpose, its heart, was being extracted under official supervision. Rebecca joined her, looking exhausted but relieved. We preserved the most important part, the historical truth. Frank's secure channels will ensure the Theta Group's contributions won't be erased from history, even if the physical artifacts disappear into government vaults. I never expected any of this when I inherited this property, Margaret said. I thought it was just a burden and unwanted piece of desert with tax problems. Instead, you became the custodian of hidden history. The connection between what happened here and events like Apollo 13, it changes our understanding of the space program entirely. Dr. Chen approached to having negotiated continued access to certain artifacts during the government evaluation. Mrs. Reynolds, there's something else you should see before they complete the removal. Something in the lowest level that we've only just discovered. In a small climate-controlled room beneath the main repository, Dr. Chen showed them what appeared to be an ordinary storage cabinet. When opened with Frank's security codes, it revealed something extraordinary, a collection of personal items from the Apollo astronauts given to Frank in appreciation for Theta Group's behind-the-scenes work. Mission patches, handwritten notes, small items that had flown to the moon and back, tokens of gratitude from men who understood how close they had come to disaster and who knew, unlike the public, about the invisible engineers who had helped save them. A handwritten letter from Jim Lovell particularly stood out. Frank, they'll never know the full story, and perhaps that's for the best. But I want you to know that I understand what really happened up there and what you and your team did long before we ever launched. The official reports will say we were saved by duct tape and ingenuity. Only a few of us will ever know about Theta Group and the systems you had ready before we ever needed them. History may not record your contributions, but those of us who came home because of your work will never forget. With eternal gratitude, Jim. The letter was accompanied by a small piece of the makeshift carbon dioxide scrubber from Apollo 13, the visible jury-rigged version that implemented Theta Group's pre-existing design principles. He gave Uncle Frank the actual filter from the mission, Rebecca whispered, the one from all the photographs and movies. Because he wanted someone to remember the truth even if it couldn't be officially acknowledged, Dr. Chen said. This is what Frank was really preserving, not just technology, but truth. As federal agents prepared the final artifacts for transport, Margaret faced a decision about her own future. The trust fund Frank had established would cover her medical expenses and provide financial security. The property itself would remain hers, though stripped of its hidden purpose. Diana Foster approached with final paperwork. Mrs. Reynolds, despite these unusual circumstances, I want to thank you for your cooperation. The historical significance of your uncle's collection will be properly recognized, though some aspects must remain classified for now. And my daughter's position at NASA, the administrative leave and security review, already being resolved. Her expertise will actually be valuable during the evaluation process given her familiarity with the materials. As sunset approached, the federal teams completed their work. The convoy of vehicles departed with their classified cargo, leaving the property eerily empty. The bunker remained its infrastructure intact, but its contents removed like a museum after the exhibits had been taken away. In the main building, Margaret, Rebecca, Bill, and Dr. Chen gathered to assess their situation. Despite the government's actions, they had achieved something significant, preserving the historical record and ensuring the Theta Group's contributions wouldn't be entirely erased from history. Frank would consider this a qualified success, Bill observed. The physical artifacts are in government hands, but the historical truth has been secured through his contingency channels. What happens now? Rebecca asked. The formal evaluation process will take months, Dr. Chen explained. Some materials will likely remain classified indefinitely, but others will eventually be cleared for historical display. The Smithsonian has already expressed interest in creating a special exhibit on previously classified aspects of the Apollo program. And what about us? Margaret gestured to the now empty property around them. This place was designed for a purpose that no longer exists. Bill Harmon smiled slightly. Maybe not the original purpose, but that doesn't mean it can't serve a new one. What kind of purpose? Frank often talked about creating a center for space history research, somewhere the full story could be told once classification restrictions eventually lifted. He designed this facility to preserve the past, but perhaps its future is education. The idea resonated with Margaret. The property's remote location and specialized facilities could be repurposed as a research center, a place where historians and engineers could study the classified aspects of space history as they gradually became declassified. The Reynolds Center for Space History, Rebecca suggested, dedicated to preserving the complete story, including the contributions of those who work behind the scenes. As night fell across the desert, the same stars that had guided Apollo astronauts appeared overhead. Margaret stepped outside, gazing upward at the vastness that had inspired her uncle's lifetime of service. The property stood empty of its historical treasures, yet somehow fuller with purpose than when she had first arrived. The inheritance she had reluctantly accepted had transformed from burden to mission. The uncle she had barely known had entrusted her with more than property. He had made her the guardian of hidden history, the caretaker of truth that might otherwise have been lost. Inside, Rebecca was already sketching plans for converting the facility, her engineering mind envisioning how spaces designed for preservation could be adapted for education. Dr. Chen discussed potential partnerships with universities and museums, while Bill reminisced about the early days when Frank had first established the repository. Margaret watched them, recognizing that her inheritance had expanded beyond the physical property to include a community united by respect for historical truth. The cancer diagnosis that had seemed all-consuming just days ago now felt like just one challenge among many in a life suddenly rich with purpose. The desert night embraced the property, a place of secrets now embarking on a journey toward revelation. The artifacts might be gone, transported to government facilities for evaluation and eventual distribution, but the story they represented would endure. Frank Reynolds had dedicated his life to preservation against the backdrop of Cold War uncertainty. Margaret would dedicate hers to revelation, ensuring that the full story of American space achievement, including its classified chapters and unsung heroes, would eventually take its rightful place in history. The stars continued their eternal procession, overhead silent witnesses, to human achievement, human sacrifice, and human determination to reach beyond earthly limitations. Somewhere among them, the legacy of Apollo continued, not just in lunar footprints and return samples, but in the quiet commitment of those who had worked behind the scenes to make it possible. And in a former classified bunker in the Arizona desert, that legacy had found new custodians determined to preserve its complete truth for future generations. 6 months passed since the federal teams had emptied Frank Reynolds' desert repository. The Arizona summer had given way to fall. Then winter and now spring bloomed across the desert landscape, painting the normally austere terrain with unexpected bursts of wildflowers. The property had transformed. Construction crews had converted the bunker's upper level into exhibition space while preserving the secure infrastructure. The main building now housed offices, research facilities, and climate-controlled storage for historical materials as they were gradually declassified and returned. Margaret stood at the window of what had once been Frank's study, now her office as director of the Reynolds Center for Space History. The medical port beneath her collarbone was gone, her cancer treatments completed successfully 3 weeks earlier. Doctors were cautiously optimistic about her prognosis. Outside, a tour bus approached the newly constructed Visitor Center University, students from Arizona State's Aerospace Engineering program, the third such group this month. Public interest had grown steadily since the center's soft opening, particularly among those who had lived through the Apollo era. Rebecca entered carrying a cardboard archive box marked with NASA insignia and security declassification stamps. The latest release from NASA archives, officially declassified Theta Group materials with Dr. Chen's authentication. Margaret opened the box. Inside lay technical documentation, photographs, and a logbook from Theta Group's earliest days. Each release added pieces to the historical puzzle they were assembling, the true story of the classified backup program that had operated in parallel with the public space effort. Any word on the Apollo 13 materials? Rebecca shook her head. Still under review. The sabotage evidence remains classified, too politically sensitive even after all these years. The partial victory had become familiar, government agencies releasing historical materials in careful increments, maintaining classification on the most sensitive aspects, while gradually acknowledging Theta Group's existence and contributions. Senator Harrison called again, Rebecca continued. He's pushing the Intelligence Committee to accelerate the declassification process for the early Theta documents. Says the historical value outweighs security concerns for materials over 50 years old. That's the third senator supporting our case. The tide is turning. Their political allies had grown steadily as the center established its credibility. The NASA Historical Division had become a key partner with Dr. Chen, serving as liaison between government archives and the Reynolds Center. Even Agent Carter's Security Division had developed a working relationship using the center's research to improve current space program security protocols. A soft chime from Margaret's computer announced an incoming video call. Diana Foster from NASA's legal department. Their former adversary had become an unexpected ally in navigating the bureaucratic processes surrounding classified historical materials. Margaret, we've received authorization for the special exhibit. The administrator signed off this morning. 6 key Theta Group artifacts will be released for public display during the Apollo 13 anniversary event. This represented a breakthrough, the first public exhibition acknowledging Operation Theta's existence and contributions. After months of careful negotiations, select artifacts would return to the rental center for a temporary exhibition coinciding with the anniversary of Apollo 13's near disaster. What about the filtration system prototype, the one that directly influenced the Apollo 13 rescue, included in the authorization, along with the mission chronograph, the backup navigation components, and selected documentation, all under appropriate security protocols, of course? Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction. Frank's mission was gradually being fulfilled. The classified history he had preserved was emerging into public view, the contributions of Theta Group engineers receiving long overdue recognition. We'll need to accelerate our exhibition preparations. The anniversary is only 3 weeks away. As plans for the exhibition intensified, Margaret received an unexpected call from Bill Harmon. The elderly neighbor's health had declined in recent months, limiting his visits to the center. Margaret, there's something I need to discuss with you. Something about Frank that I've never told anyone. His tone carried unusual urgency. Margaret drove to his modest home that afternoon, finding him more frail than during their last meeting, but his eyes remained sharp beneath bushy white brows. I received a letter yesterday from an old colleague I hadn't heard from in decades. He's dying pancreatic cancer and wanted to clear his conscience before the end. Bill handed her an envelope containing a handwritten letter on yellowed stationery. The penmanship was shaky but legible, the words of an elderly man making a final confession. The letter described events from 1967, specifically the Apollo 1 fire that had killed astronauts Grissom White and Chaffee during a launch pad test. The writer had been part of the engineering team responsible for the command module hatch, designed the inward opening door that had trapped the astronauts when fire broke out. Frank was also on that design team, Bill explained quietly, though his role wasn't widely known outside the program. The letter continued, revealing the writer's decades of guilt over design compromises that had prioritized mission requirements over safety concerns. Most shocking was the claim that several engineers, including Frank Reynolds, had formally objected to the hatch design months before the accident. Their warnings were documented but overruled by management pressure to maintain the launch schedule. After the fire, those objections were excluded from the official investigation to protect NASA's reputation during a critical period of the space race. Margaret read the final paragraphs with growing unease. Frank took it hardest among us. He had been the most vocal about the hatch design flaws, even designing an alternative emergency release system that was rejected as unnecessary. After the fire, he was devastated, convinced he could have prevented it if he'd pushed harder. When Theta Group formed, he threw himself into that work with almost religious dedication. I always believed it was his way of atoning for what happened to Grissom and the others. I'm sharing this now because someone should know the truth. Frank wasn't just a brilliant engineer preserving space history, he was a man driven by profound guilt, dedicating his life to ensuring no similar failures would ever occur again. Every emergency system he designed, every backup protocol he established, was born from his determination that no more lives would be lost due to institutional compromises or ignored warnings. Margaret looked up from the letter, finding Bill's expression somber. Did you know about this? Not the specific details. Frank never discussed Apollo 1 directly, too painful, but I understood he carried some burden related to it. Now I know why he devoted his life to Theta Group with such intensity. This revelation cast Frank's lifetime work in a new light. Not just classified service or historical preservation, but personal redemption, a half-century mission born from guilt and determination that no other astronauts would die from preventable failures. Does this change how you see him? Bill asked. No, it deepens my understanding of him, makes his dedication more human, more relatable. He would have wanted you to know, I think, especially now that you're bringing Theta Group's work into the light. Margaret took the letter, recognizing its historical significance, another piece of the complex mosaic they were assembling about the classified aspects of the space program and the people behind them. Back at the center, preparations for the Apollo 13 anniversary exhibition accelerated. NASA technicians delivered the authorized artifacts, each item revealing aspects of Theta Group's classified work during the crisis. The centerpiece was the original filtration system prototype, the technology that had directly influenced the improvised solution famously constructed from spare parts during Apollo 13's emergency. Displayed alongside were Frank's design documents showing how Theta Group had developed the system months before the mission as part of their emergency preparedness protocols. Margaret worked with Dr. Chen to create exhibition text that balanced historical accuracy with security constraints. The sabotage evidence remained classified, forcing them to present the oxygen tank failure as an accident, while highlighting Theta Group's role in developing the emergency systems that saved the crew. 2 days before the exhibition opening, Rebecca discovered something unexpected while preparing the filtration system for display. Hidden within the prototype's documentation case was a sealed envelope addressed to family of Francis Reynolds Confidential. It's Uncle Frank's handwriting, Rebecca confirmed. He must have added this to the artifact's case before it was removed by the federal teams. The envelope contained a letter and a small data storage device designed for long-term archiving. Frank's message was brief but profound. To my niece Margaret, or whoever in our family discovers this, if you're reading this, you've succeeded in bringing some portion of Theta Group's work into the light. There is one final aspect of our history that may never be officially declassified, but deserves to be preserved within our family. The attached data contains my personal testimony regarding Apollo 1 and events that shaped my life's work. I could not include this in the official Theta archives due to security restrictions, but as my final act, I entrust this truth to my family. The historical record shows the Apollo 1 fire as a tragic accident resulting from multiple factors: unsafe materials, pure oxygen environment, and an inward opening hatch that couldn't be quickly opened. What remains classified is why those design compromises occurred despite engineer objections. The enclosed testimony explains everything. View it privately before deciding whether this truth should remain within our family or someday be shared with the world. With respect and gratitude, Francis Reynolds, Colonel USAF, Return. Margaret and Rebecca viewed the data file in the secure research room away from other staff. The video showed Frank in his later years speaking directly to the camera with the clear intention of creating a historical record. My name is Francis Reynolds, Colonel, United States Air Force, retired, former aerospace engineer with NASA contractor Grumman, and founding member of Operation Theta. This testimony is my personal account of classified events surrounding the Apollo program, specifically the Apollo 1 tragedy and its aftermath. Frank's testimony began with his early career, his transition from Air Force engineering to the space program, his work on spacecraft environmental systems and hatch mechanisms. He detailed his growing concerns about safety compromises as the Apollo program accelerated under pressure to beat Soviet competition to the moon. The Apollo 1 command module had multiple safety issues that several of us documented through official channels. The inward opening hatch was particularly problematic. It couldn't be opened quickly in an emergency, especially if cabin pressure increased. I designed an alternative emergency release system, but it was rejected as unnecessary complexity that would delay the schedule. Frank describes submitting formal safety objections with supporting engineering analysis documents that would later vanish from official records after the fire. His voice remained steady, but his eyes reflected decades-old pain as he recounted learning about the accident that killed 3 astronauts. We lost Grissom, White, and Chaffee because schedule pressure overcame safety concerns. But what few people know what remains classified is why that pressure was so intense. We were sacrificing safety margins to beat the Soviets, yes, but there was another factor: intelligence indicated Soviet sabotage attempts against the program. This revelation aligned with the Apollo 13 sabotage evidence they had discovered in the repository. Frank continued explaining that classified intelligence had uncovered multiple Soviet operations targeting the American space program, attempts to infiltrate manufacturing facilities, compromise components, or influence design decisions through placed agents. After Apollo 1, a classified investigation ran parallel to the public one. It confirmed that while the fire itself wasn't sabotage, some of the design compromises that made it possible had been influenced by individuals with connections to Soviet intelligence. Subtle pressure applied at key decision points, technical arguments that prioritized schedule over safety, small influences that accumulated into disaster. Frank described the formation of Operation Theta as a direct response to this discovery, a classified program to develop backup systems, establish security protocols, and create redundancies that would protect against both accidents and deliberate sabotage. Theta Group's existence was classified not just to maintain technical secrecy, but because acknowledging it would mean revealing the infiltration. During the height of the Cold War, this could have escalated tensions beyond diplomatic control. So we worked in shadows, our contributions unacknowledged, developing the systems that would later save Apollo 13 when disaster struck. The most personal segment came last. Frank's explanation of why he had dedicated his life to this classified work, maintaining the desert repository decades after the Apollo program ended. I could have prevented Apollo 1 if I'd been more forceful, if I'd recognized the subtle patterns of compromise that were occurring. That failure haunted me throughout my career. Every system I designed for Theta Group, every backup protocol I established was my attempt to ensure no other astronauts would die because warnings went unheeded. He paused, his expression softening slightly. But there was another reason more personal still. Gus Grissom was more than a name to me. We had served together briefly in the Air Force before he joined NASA. I knew his family. After the fire, I promised his widow, Betty, that I would make sure the full story was preserved even if it couldn't be told immediately. That someday, when classification restrictions eventually lifted, the complete true truth would be known, not just how they died, but why and what was done to prevent similar tragedies. Frank's final words were directed explicitly toward whoever would find his testimony. I don't know who in my family will discover this recording or when. Perhaps the full story will already be declassified by then. But if not, I entrust this truth to you. The decision of what to do with it is yours. My obligation was to preserve it. Yours is to judge when the world is ready to hear it. The recording ended, leaving Margaret and Rebecca in stunned silence. This final revelation transformed their understanding of Frank Reynolds completely, not just a dedicated engineer or even a man seeking redemption, but someone fulfilling a personal promise to the family of a fallen colleague. What do we do with this? Rebecca finally asked. The Apollo 1 details would be explosive even now, suggesting Soviet influence on NASA design decisions during the Cold War. Margaret considered the implications carefully. Frank had preserved this testimony separately from the official Theta archives, suggesting he understood it might never be appropriate for public release. Yet he had ensured it would survive, that the complete truth would not be lost to history. We honor his wishes. Keep this within the family for now, but preserve it properly. There may come a time when this history can be shared without damaging the institution he served or the program he believed in. The Apollo 13 anniversary exhibition opened 2 days later. Hundreds of visitors, many of them veterans of the space program, came to see the declassified Theta Group artifacts and learn about the classified backup systems that had helped save the Apollo 13 crew. The exhibition acknowledged Frank Reynolds and other Theta engineers by name, the first public recognition of their contributions. Photographs showed them working alongside more famous figures like Gene Kranz and Chris Kraft, filling gaps in the historical record that had existed for decades. Margaret observed the visitors with satisfaction. Elderly men who had worked in the space program studied the technical displays with knowing eyes, occasionally nodding in recognition. Younger attendees marveled at the ingenuity of 1960s engineering, gaining new appreciation for the complexity behind America's journey to the moon. During a quiet moment, an elderly woman approached Margaret, stylishly dressed despite her obvious age, with a dignity that suggested significance beyond her years. "You're Margaret Reynolds, Frank's niece." "Yes, I am. Welcome to the center." "I'm Martha Chaffee, Roger's widow." Margaret recognized the name immediately of Roger Chaffee, one of the Apollo 1 astronauts who had died in the fire. This woman had lost her husband in the tragedy that had so profoundly influenced Frank's life. "Mrs. Chaffee, I'm honored to meet you. Thank you for coming. I wanted to see what Frank preserved all these years. We knew each other. All the astronaut families knew the key engineers. After the fire, Frank visited each family personally. He made promises to us." Margaret felt a chill of recognition. Frank's testimony had mentioned his promise to Grissom's widow. Apparently, he had made similar commitments to all 3 Apollo 1 families. What kind of promises? That the full story would be preserved, that their deaths wouldn't be in vain, that future missions would have safeguards they didn't have. Martha gestured toward the exhibition. "Looking at this, I'd say he kept those promises." He dedicated his life to it. I know, we corresponded occasionally over the years. He never shared classified details, but he would let me know when new safety systems he'd developed were implemented in the program. Martha's eyes showed both grief and pride. Those systems saved lives, Apollo 13 and other missions that never made headlines because their emergencies were averted before becoming crises. This perspective from someone who had known Frank during the darkest period of the space program added another dimension to Margaret's understanding of her uncle's life work. There were rumors, Martha continued more quietly, among the astronaut families, that Apollo 1 wasn't just an accident, that there were influences working against the program from within. Frank never confirmed this explicitly, but there were things he said, implications. What do you believe happened? I believe what the official record states an accident caused by multiple factors. But I also believe there's more to the story that remains classified. Perhaps necessarily so. Martha studied Margaret's expression. I think you know more than you can say publicly, just as Frank did. The perceptiveness of this observation confirmed Margaret's decision to keep Frank's final testimony private, at least for now. Some truths remained too sensitive, even decades later, for those who had lived through the events and lost loved ones. I believe my uncle did everything in his power to honor your husband's memory and protect future astronauts. He did, more than most people will ever know. Martha squeezed Margaret's hand briefly. Thank you for continuing his work, bringing the parts of this history that can be shared into the light. As the exhibition continued, Dr. Chen approached with news from NASA headquarters. The successful opening and positive public response had influenced ongoing classification reviews. The administrator has authorized release of additional Theta materials, including limited acknowledgement of security concerns during the program. While the specific sabotage evidence remains classified, they'll permit discussion of foreign interest in the Apollo program and countermeasures developed in response. This represented another incremental victory, the government gradually allowing more of the classified history to emerge while maintaining restrictions on the most sensitive aspects. The day concluded with a ceremony honoring the Theta Group engineers. Those still living attended in person, while others were represented by family members. For the first time, their contributions received formal public recognition, with NASA officials acknowledging the parallel classified program that had operated alongside the public space effort. Later that evening, as the center emptied of visitors, Margaret stood alone in the exhibition space. The filtration system prototype, the technology that had helped save Apollo 13, gleamed under carefully designed lighting. Beside it, photographs showed Frank and his Theta colleagues working at consoles during the crisis, their expressions intense with concentration. Rebecca joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Quite a day. I think Uncle Frank would be proud. Not just of the exhibition, of what we've accomplished with the center. It's becoming what he envisioned, a place where the complete history can gradually emerge. They moved through the exhibition, reviewing the displays they had created. Each artifact told part of a story that had remained classified for decades. The backup systems, the emergency protocols, the contingency technologies developed by engineers working without public recognition. I've been thinking about Frank's testimony, Margaret said quietly, about his promise to the Apollo 1 families. Do you think we should ever release it publicly? Not now, perhaps not in our lifetime, but we should preserve it properly, ensure it survives for future historians when the full story can be told without reopening wounds or damaging institutions. A time capsule for future generations? Exactly. Just as Frank preserved these artifacts for decades until the world was ready to acknowledge them. They reached the exhibition's final display, a memorial wall honoring the Theta Group engineers. Frank's photograph held a central position, his military portrait showing a younger man with clear eyes and determined expression. The accompanying text summarized his career in carefully worded terms that respected remaining classification restrictions while acknowledging his significance. There's something we should add to his biography, Margaret decided. Something important that isn't classified. What's that? That he kept his promises. To the astronauts' families, to his colleagues, to history itself. That beyond his engineering brilliance and classified service was a man of profound personal integrity who dedicated his life to ensuring others wouldn't experience loss as he had. Rebecca nodded. A fitting tribute, and completely true. As they prepared to leave, Margaret took a final look at the exhibition artifacts returned from government vaults. Historical documentation gradually emerging from classification, the contributions of anonymous engineers finally receiving recognition. The property she had reluctantly inherited had become something her uncle would have approved, not just a museum preserving technological history, but an institution dedicated to revealing the complete story of America's journey into space, including its classified chapters and the people who worked in shadows. Outside, the desert night spread across the landscape, stars gleaming with particular clarity in the Arizona sky. The same stars that had guided Apollo astronauts half a century earlier, that had inspired her uncle's lifetime of dedicated service. Margaret thought of Frank's final testimony, his personal account of events that had shaped his life and career. While that specific truth remained private for now, preserved for future generations, the broader mission he had begun was continuing through her work at the center. The inheritance she had once considered a burden had transformed into profound purpose. The uncle she had barely known had entrusted her with not just property and artifacts, but with truth itself, the responsibility of preserving history in all its complexity, revealing it when possible, and protecting it when necessary. As she drove away from the center, Margaret felt a deep sense of connection across time to Frank, to the Theta engineers, to the astronauts whose lives had been protected by their classified work. Different generations united by commitment to exploration, innovation, and the preservation of knowledge for those who would follow. The desert outpost that had once hidden classified treasures now stood as a beacon of historical truth, gradually revealing a hidden chapter of American achievement, one declassified document, one returned artifact, one acknowledged contribution at a time. Frank Reynolds had preserved the past. Margaret Reynolds would illuminate it for the future. The inheritance was complete. 5 years have passed since the Reynolds Center for Space History opened its doors. What began as a converted desert bunker has expanded into a nationally recognized institution, a place where classified history gradually emerges into public view as security restrictions allow. The center's main exhibition hall now features a permanent display entitled "The Shadow Engineers Operation Theta and America's Space Program." Photographs of Frank Reynolds and his colleagues hang alongside more famous figures from NASA history, their contributions finally acknowledged in the official record. Margaret Reynolds stands at the podium during the center's anniversary ceremony. Her cancer has been in remission for 4 years. Behind her, a wall of honor lists names of Theta Group engineers, some only recently declassified. America's journey to the moon was never just about reaching a destination. It was about who we were as a nation, our capacity for innovation, our willingness to take risks, our ability to transform failure into knowledge and tragedy into progress. The audience includes NASA officials, historians, former astronauts, and families of Theta engineers. Many are elderly now, witnesses to a history that unfolded partly in shadows. When we opened this center, we committed to illuminating the complete story of our space program, including chapters that remain classified for decades. Not to diminish achievements we celebrate, but to deepen our understanding of their true complexity. Among the honored guests sits Martha Chaffee, now in her 90s, representing the Apollo 1 families. Beside her are children and grandchildren of Theta engineers learning about their family members' classified contributions. Organizations can make mistakes. Institutions can prioritize achievement over safety secrecy, over transparency schedule, over caution. The Apollo 1 fire remains a sobering reminder of those dangers. But within these same organizations worked individuals of extraordinary dedication and integrity. Men and women who advocated for safer systems, developed backup technologies, and ensured missions had multiple paths to success. On display nearby is the most recently declassified Theta artifact, a backup guidance system developed after Apollo 12 was struck by lightning during launch. The technology was never needed, but represented the constant behind-the-scenes work to anticipate and prevent disaster. My uncle Francis Reynolds was one such individual. His classified work with Theta Group embodied a particular kind of patriotism, not the kind that overlooks institutional flaws, but the kind that works tirelessly to address them. He understood that serving your country sometimes means challenging its organizations to live up to their highest ideals. Rebecca Reynolds, now the center's director of research, watches from the side. Under her leadership, the center has established educational programs connecting retired engineers with aerospace students, ensuring knowledge passes to new generations. As we look toward America's future in space, we carry forward lessons from both our triumphs and our failures. The technologies have evolved, but the fundamental challenges remain balancing ambition with safety, innovation with reliability, classified necessity with public transparency. The latest NASA mission patch is displayed alongside historical Apollo emblems, visual evidence of continuing exploration built upon foundations laid decades earlier. This center exists to preserve truth in all its complexity. Some aspects of Operation Theta remain classified even now, awaiting future declassification when security considerations permit. We accept this reality while maintaining our commitment that the complete historical record will eventually emerge. Outside the center's windows, the Arizona desert stretches toward distant mountains, the same landscape that once concealed Frank Reynolds' classified repository. The property that Margaret once considered a burden has become a place of pilgrimage for those seeking deeper understanding of America's space history. The story of America in space is ultimately about individuals making difficult choices within imperfect systems. Engineers raising safety concerns despite schedule pressure, and astronauts trusting their lives to technologies they couldn't fully examine. Classified teams developing backup systems that might never be acknowledged. A group of university students listens attentively. Among them are future engineers and astronauts who will face their own complex decisions, balancing mission objectives, safety considerations, and institutional pressures. When we honor these individuals, both famous and previously unacknowledged, we recognize that national achievement emerges not just from institutional direction, but from personal integrity multiplied across thousands of dedicated lives. The afternoon sun casts long shadows across the center's grounds, where the original bunker entrance has been preserved as a historical landmark. What once hid classified treasures now stands as a symbol of emerging truth, the gradual transition from necessary secrecy to historical understanding. As we face new frontiers in space exploration, we carry forward not just technological knowledge, but ethical wisdom purchased at great cost. The lessons of Apollo, both public and previously classified, continue to guide our steps beyond Earth. The desert stars will soon appear overhead, silent witnesses to human aspiration, achievement, sacrifice, and the long journey toward complete historical truth. Frank Reynolds kept his lonely vigil beneath these stars for decades. The center that bears his name now continues that mission of preservation and revelation, safeguarding the past while illuminating the future.